This is episode 2 of the Venus Rising podcast, where we seek to personalize the profound by exploring the esoteric, the philosophic, the artistic, and the whimsical. Because without the whimsical, it would all be predictable. Today, we have the illustrious pleasure of being joined with author of over 26 books on Western esoteric spirituality, founder and director of the Institute of Hermetic Studies, Mark Stavish. Mark, it is a joy to be with you today, brother.
Oh, I thank you very much. I welcome the opportunity. I know you've discussed off and on wanting to do this podcast, and you've jumped right in. So I figure I would be seen as one of your early pioneers in the experience. So
well, thank you for playing guinea pig. The first first round was a rough go, but I'll work into it.
Oh, the guinea pig parts of and I noticed you have a blue cup there. I have one too. This is our official Institute for Hermetic Studies coffee cup, which we're trying to price out for people. So your listeners will be able to purchase them at the end of the broadcast.
For our next interview,
for the next interview.
One.
So we've got to get you one.
That's right.
What good is it without some bling, right? So,
do you make turtlenecks?
We're working on those. We need to get a price for the cruise shirts first.
Yeah. All my friends have been giving me crap growing up in the South all these years for it'll be 90-degree weather in July and I'm wearing a turtleneck. They're like, Eric, what is wrong with you? Hey, it's my thing.
Tell them it's a white knit.
Here you go. Well, Mark, first off, I want to give you tremendous kudos and congratulations. I've been following your work for quite a few years now, casually being connected on social media. You are very engaged with your audience. You're always producing content. Your last book you came out with, Egregores, the Occult Entities That Govern Human Destiny, surprisingly seemed to sort of cross that barrier into a lot of public acknowledgement, which is strange for occult books. It got a lot of ripples. You did really good with that one.
Well, thank you. We did a lot of good. We also offended a lot of people. And, the book has a strange story. I've told it before, but I'll tell it again. It just came out of a conversation. I was with Jocelyn Godwin and we were in the Lost Dog Cafe in Ithaca, New York. No, excuse me, Binghamton, New York. And we were just talking and I said, I think I'm going to write a monograph on egregores, something small for, the select audience. And he said something to the effect of, well, thank God if you don't, I'll have to. And I kind of laughed about it and I went home and I just started it because I had a lot of notes already. It was a topic many of us had discussed, but even within occult circles, we have to be honest. It was a term thrown around, but never really discussed well. And there were no books on it. Nothing. I think there might have been one in French, but I'm not certain about the date. So I wrote it and I sent it off to Intertraditions. And they loved it. And it was really like baby bear's porridge for a book. I wanted to add more, but I just couldn't find a good place to do it. It felt like it would be forced. And when I wrote it, it was really just as if we were having a conversation. That's why you'll notice that the chapter breaks are somewhat arbitrary. It's really kind of topical, but when the manuscript was written, it was just, we wrote it like a conversation. That's all.
And regarding those notes, I can only imagine a person like in your position who has been working with this material, studying with this material, founding an educational institution, teaching people Hermeticism. Dear Lord, the notes, I cannot even imagine the notes you probably have piling around that could always be reworked into blogs, into conversations, etc.
Well, it's true because when I talk with people, I take notes. People ask me, how was I able to write the memoir on Leshevsky? And because we talked a lot. And I wrote a lot of notes about those conversations because there was useful information in them. It wasn't just, chatting away. I have, longtime students and patrons who, they can call me any time of the day or night and they'll get a response. And the conversations we have, the information they have, the angle and approach that they have, the special use of language and words from their professional experience that they have, I write down, and they know it because now they trust me. That's why they're talking to me, but also it's grist for the mill in terms of how we approach these topics and trying to get them on a more understandable level. I think what makes egregores fascinating is the response among the esoteric community. You know, if you go to Amazon and you read the reviews, they love it or they hate it. And what they hate about it is really not the book, but they hate Jim Wasserman's introduction. And I find that fascinating too, as well, because a lot of that's been verified over the last year and a half or more years. And I think there, even the Guardian had an article today that supports many of the statements in there. And I think this is very fascinating because what we saw there was the egregore, that is a collective awareness of a prescribed philosophical doctrine, became so entrenched across New Age, esoteric, new and emerging religious circles that they were unable to get out of it. And that's why they reacted so violently towards it. The violent reaction was an indication of the strength of the trap their minds are in. And I found it surprising people I knew and respected didn't want to review the book. They said, well, I said, well, you're not reviewing the introduction, you're reviewing the book. Review what I wrote if you don't like it. Many people couldn't do that. Now, of course, the kickback has been that James died in November. And a month or so ago, I got a call, an email from Inner Traditions. And he was good friends with Ehud, the founder of Inner Traditions. They knew each other from Wiser days in New York. And, the question was, we've been asked by media partners, and I want that word in quotes, media partners, if we could have that, we could remove that from future editions. Well, what that means is the book won't get distributed unless they take that out. I want the listeners to hear that. They need to know that. They need to understand that this is the situation we're in now. So that shows the strength of those collective egregores, those consciousness. And it is our job, to become awakened. That means enlightened on something, and that means free, to be able to see things more clearly. Now, it's always going to be difficult until you're a fully awakened being, whatever that is. However, we have to be open to possibilities. That is the beginning. Open to possibilities, and open to possibilities that first of all, we don't know everything. That's easy to say, but actually accepting it is another thing. It's like when people say, well, nobody's perfect. Well, that's just an excuse for saying I don't have to change. That's really what the word is. No, I don't have to do anything. No. Well, okay, good. We have to open to the possibilities that we don't know what's really going on. And that can be really terrifying, particularly occultists who like to believe they've got some secret line to the invisible that they know. And again, having a lot of experience in the media, with and in media, and in some aspects of government too, through social services, I have a pretty good idea of the way things work. I've always been lucky. My jobs have always been like a hub, with all these information streams coming into it. So I've always been privy to a lot of information from different sources. And trying to get that through to readers, as you saw over the last year, it's been met with tremendous hostility, aggression, verbal violence, character attack. Okay, yeah. So what?
Character assassination by affiliation runs rampant nowadays.
Well, and that leads us to the next point. That means that those people can't go anywhere on their path. That needs to be clearly understood. I mean, you're not going anywhere on your spiritual journey if that's the way you're approaching things. And the teachers who have been teaching them, and a lot of them have been very vocal, and a lot of them also very vulgar and crude, they demonstrate their lack of insight and their lack of self-control, their lack of restraint. And with that said, they can't really help you. So where does that lead us? Where does that leave us in terms of the state of contemporary spirituality as a whole, is the big picture, which is what we're focusing on? And then within our framework, the state of contemporary Western esoteric groups and studies. And there's several answers to that question because it leads us in several directions.
Yeah. I recently went back to one of your older posts on the Vox Hermes blog that you update regularly. This was a post, I believe, from 2018, and it was like a deja vu trip down memory lane for me because I remember when you posted that and you were speaking of loosely of some insider gossip within the occult community, and you very strategically and politely didn't drop any names, didn't make any references, but it was a topic that I was privy to personally. And the point the point that you wanted to drill into all of our heads as occultists, as spiritual practitioners, as members of any institution or group was basically the importance of management, that can be so easy to overlook, and yet it is precisely fundamental.
Yes, we're only as good as our leaders because we produce our leaders. And, to drive that point home, because it was such an offensive point the last few months, I've worked in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Most of the listeners here don't even know where that is.
The office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I understand Lackawanna County politics. I understand Luzerne County politics. And I would point out to them, you really don't know what's going on here. You have no idea. And I would tell them, and they would be offended because it offended their ideal. It offended what they wanted to believe. And that's the same thing with, when we look at politics and we look at philosophy and we look at religion and business, we're looking at Jupiterian things. We're looking at big picture stuff. We're looking at big ideals. And when we look at esotericism, we tend to act as if we can separate it out from the rest of the culture. When in fact, there has a very intimate feedback loop with culture. In the past, it produced culture. Now it's more impacted by it. And we see that with the obsession of occulture. That's even come into the mainstream, the use of that phrase. So the idea of the occult symbols in popular media. You go to, the gift shops like Spencer's in the mall, if you still have a Spencer's or still have a mall, and they have all this Ouija board stuff, or they have now whatever happens to be some kind of, funky occult stuff. And there's so much of it, and it's not seasonal anymore. It's not just for Halloween. It's all the time. And when that pushes the liminal into the center stage, things collapse. Because it's liminal. It's not meant to be in the town square. It's not meant to be center stage. But with that, too many of the people involved in esotericism are themselves obsessed with the liminal. So, we look to the history of occultists and occultism, and we like to point to Cagliostro, whose birthday is today, or Comte de Saint-Germain, or all these great folks. But when you sit in your lodge, you don't have movers and shakers in that lodge. Very rarely. I mean, I've been in lodges where there's movers and shakers, but it's still rare. Okay. And you have to ask yourself, why is it? We hear about the elites and their occult interests, and to some degree that's true. The Mellon banking family donated its entire occult library to Yale, and you can easily find out what that collection is online. I mean, it's in the journals. So we have to ask ourselves, why is there this huge disconnect between contemporary occultists and the rest of society? And what is the effect of that disconnect? And to what degree does that become a egregore or isolating principle? And I think that we see a great deal of that. That sense of specialness comes up, that special uniqueness. And that's why I wrote the book, Pathology of the Sublime. Well, the seminar, we gave the seminar first, and then the book came later. What are the things that can go wrong on the path? In the past, you had a mentor. You had someone who could hold your nose to it, quite literally, and keep you on the straight and narrowish. Now we have a lot of people who think they can just learn off books or learn from podcasts or learn from whatever, they different courses. And you can to some degree. But what you really can't do is have that relationship where someone holds your nose to the problem and says, this is what you need to do right now. I don't even need to tell you why, but you need to do it. And through that experience, you'll find out why.
This brings to mind The Wizard of Oz. That was the first full-length, full-color film that ever came out, and it was written by Frank L. Baum, who was a theosophist, a student of Blavatsky. Incorporated into the symbology of that story is a tremendous amount of valuable occult knowledge. But back then, these old-timers who would, like you were saying, become movers and shakers in society and culture, they would often very strategically trickle in esoteric wisdom into society. And as you mentioned, the whole rise of occulture. My goodness, my children, my two young boys, when they found out I was a Freemason, God, they were like, what, 5 and 6 or 7 years old? Their first question was, Dad, are you in the Illuminati? I'm thinking, how do you know about the Illuminati? Kids these days, it's terrible.
Yeah, and what we see is increasingly people have their views of the occult shaped by media. And occultists don't really want to admit to that, but who are the people that turned the show Supernatural into a 15-year run? It was occultists. Who are the people who you see many of the shows on cable, not cable, but on select television, whether it's Amazon Prime or Netflix. Where do you see who's that aimed at? That's aimed at occultists, so to speak, and occultists of a certain age. And that age group tends to be between the ages of 15 and 30, sometimes a little younger. And this is problematic because when you look at the occult groups 100 years ago, the average age of a member was probably 35 or 40. And within that framework, the books now are aimed at a 15 to 28-year-old, 25-year-old. So the fact that we are still very infantile or mercurial, adolescent-y, which you see so dominant in the majority of the movements, is simply a reflection of the fact that the material is written for adolescents. Now, there are exceptions to that, but I'm not certain that a lot of the gourmet grimoires that we see being published really have value. They're beautiful books. I mean, some of them are stunning. I know this. I have them. However, even there's the context of, we used to call them armchair magicians. People had great libraries. It's wonderful to have a great library, but what can you do? What do you know? Where does the experience? So we see, again, media shaping the views of the occult and what the occult is and should be. And that then gets turned into a lot of false notions and ideas and expectations, particularly around teachers. Probably the worst of that was Star Wars and Yoda, and Obi-Wan. Everyone's into Yoda, right? You don't want a Yoda. I tell people, you don't want me as your teacher. Like, because, there's a couple ways we can do this. One is you read the books, and that's nice, and that's good. The other is you join some courses, and the courses are good. The other is you get involved in some Q&A, and you get to have a relationship where we can answer questions and help you out. And the other is where you're really a student. That's where I hold your nose to stuff. And that's where people don't like. But that's what a teacher really does, is they help refine you and they help shape you. And not necessarily in a prescribed way. It's not like there's a particular outcome, but to shape you in general, to shape your thinking process, to shape your self-perception so that it becomes strong, wide, deep, and useful. I mean, that's the notion of the rough ashlar in Freemasonry. The rough ashlar becomes the smooth ashlar, but its essential dimensions are still the same. It's a cube. Well, why? Because symbolically what that means is that cube is useful anywhere in the building of the temple. It can become anything. It can become all things to all men. And that was one of the secrets of the Jesuits. The Jesuits are an extremely influential group. They're, even as many people know, and some don't, suppressed by the Catholic Church at various times. And one of the things that Jesuits were told when they were sent on their mission was become a confidant before you seek to become a converter. Become all things to all men. And of course, mostly that was focused at leadership, because without leadership behind you, you either ended up jail or in debt or at best kicked out of the country. We don't see that in contemporary esotericism. We don't see the ability to help people be useful in all situations. Building of character. There's focus on ritual. There's focus on book collections. There's focus on political notions and activities, whatever your drug of choice is, and all sorts of very public displays of your occult knowledge. But the idea of being a successful human being, that's just too mundane. And you know what I'm talking about, because you've seen it, so have I. And that's because we focus too much on a culture that is adolescent. Occultism is really for teenagers. And it wasn't always that way. And if it is to be useful and survive, it has to grow up and start being something adults are involved in. And I just don't mean by age. I mean by temperament. I know that's harsh, but that's the reality. Because if it weren't, there'd be more successful occult groups out there. By their fruits, you'll know them.
Mm-hmm. The strong personalities that you come across in the occult community, I must admit, I've been one myself at times, and I still have to work on that. The people themselves, I think, are not entirely to blame. And I'm sure you'd agree with that. Sometimes it is inherently built into the system or to the culture, perhaps. Regarding Golden Dawn groups in general, it has been my experience that any egoic inflations or personality distortions that might arise here and there within different groups, I'm probably going to ponder this phenomenon sociologically and psychologically for the rest of my life. But so far, my observation seems to be that one of the things you mentioned there, the popularization of a cult, that it's cool, it's trendy, secret knowledge, blah, blah, blah. That's a big issue because it does attract the wrong types of people, perhaps. Maturity plays a role. Another issue is when it comes to effective ceremonial workings or initiations or any kind of a occult practice that you're delving into, if done without great care and wisdom and guidance, the results can be quite real and quite detrimental. There can be periods that potentially could have been transformative and used for personal growth, because when you enter and many years later, if you consider yourself an adept or whatnot, as you mentioned, you cannot remain as you are. You will have to chip things away. There will be changes, and sometimes those changes can be dramatic in people's personal life. Personality distortions, perhaps falling out with groups, perhaps going off on your own and thinking you're the next guru, etc. So the warnings of caution regarding occultism, I think, are very well founded.
Well, I think we have several issues here. One is that the Golden Dawn is a good example because it's what most people know of as magic. And with that said, the Golden Dawn doesn't have a foundational philosophical view. So the notion of ritual purity, physical purity, emotional, psychological purity that you find in other systems simply is absent. There's notions of banishing of purity, but you're not really told what that is. And you don't have anyone holding your nose to it to, recognize that what you do in the ritual circle then also has to be carried over into daily life. That you can't just try and get rid of one thing and then pile it on as another. And you have to be told what that is. You have to be told what to do. So Rigardi hinted at that with psychological counseling. But that's very few people seem to go that route. I think the other issue with the Golden Dawn is, contrary to what many people would like to believe, it is fundamentally an outer tantra because it's so externally oriented. Even in its most deep psychological aspects, it's still mostly externally oriented towards ritual rather than inner transformation. It has inner transformative rituals, but I don't think they're truly understood well because you see books out there, and I came across one on a shelf yesterday that I was asked to write a jacket blurb for, 15 years ago when it came out, and I politely did. And it's people who are learning from books and then trying to set themselves up as an authority from their experience based only on books rather than what is verbal tradition. Pat Zaleski is one of the few folks who had connection to one of the last surviving Golden Dawn lodges. I myself grew up in an environment where I was around these people from a very young age, esotericists and occultists. Again, I've said before, I was in lodges with people who were something. Okay. One of them was brought over on Operation Paperclip. It was the other was General Mark Clark's translator after the fall of Munich. Another was involved in various OSS things back in the day. So these were adults. These are people with serious life experience. And there were other people who were, again, maybe always not as wealthy or as well positioned, but they brought serious life experience to what was going on. They didn't put up with crap, and they wouldn't tolerate it from you. So there was a certain level of maturity in what was going on. And again, there's always exceptions, but within the framework of the GD, if you simply have the books to go on in your own experience, you have nothing to test it against. So what we see in is this belief that more is always better. And I had this conversation with a fellow maybe 2 weeks ago. He is a celebrity mentor, and these are celebrities. The thing is, again, we're going to be a celebrity occultist. That's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Celebrity mentor said, to really do this, you got to be doing so many hours a day of practice. And I said, well, hold on. When you say to get any results, well, what are those results you're supposed to get? You're free to ask that question. What will those results look like? Because if you have a practice, you should be asking, what is this practice? Question one. How is it performed? Wrapped into it. How is it performed? Where did it come from? And what results can I expect? So you should ask those 3 questions. What will those results look like? Now, what is often failed to mention about magic is it's inherently destabilizing. People lie to themselves and they lie to you and they say, I come to magic because I want to, what do you want? I want to become more. I want to learn. No, you don't. What you want is you want a new girlfriend. You want a new boyfriend. You're miserable with your life. You want a new job. Be honest about what you want. That's the first thing, because we can move you towards the other stuff. You're going to have to move towards the other stuff. But if you're not honest about the fact that you're just miserable with your life and your self-concept, and that's why you're doing this, then it's going to be very difficult to move forward. So we fail to tell people, I don't, but we often see it, that magic is inherently destabilizing. Because if you're banishing something, that means you're getting rid of something. That means you will not be the same. Not just your environment, but something about you will not be the same when it's done. That will create a void, and nature abhors a vacuum, and that void will be filled. So if you do this banishing 6 or 12 times a day, you're going to be getting rid of a lot of stuff. And if you're not specific about what that is, then theoretically, some aspect of your psyche is going to decide what's best to get rid of, even if it means your job, your car, or your family. Okay. So we have to recognize magic is inherently destabilizing. And you can't do it for 2 hours a day, an hour a day, okay, week after week, month after month, without there being significant consequences, karma, cause, effect. So you have to have your magical practice first and foremost based upon an inner discipline of meditation and mental training. That's what the Golden Dawn also doesn't have. It didn't have, at least from what we see in the literature, a practice of mental training. So people have these experiences and they don't understand their own mind well enough, and they go off into fantasy land. So, instead of wanting to jump into rituals, which by the way, those rituals only came after the portal grade. So you were already in anywhere from, I think if the numbers worked out, you were in there about 3.5 years before you got to Adeptus Minor. Portal's 9 months. Okay. So you get in there, then you get all those things we think of as the Golden Dawn, which was the second order rituals. And it would take you probably 5 years minimum before you went on to the next grade. And of course, there's questions about what the lodges had in terms of, 6 equals 5 and 7 equals 4, but that's not doesn't really matter. And I have seen some of those curriculums, and quite frankly, they're not very impressive. And what I mean by that is those are philosophical views being developed in those grades that should be inculcated from the very beginning. It would save a lot of time and suffering. But also, again, the mental training would save a lot of time and suffering too. So then you talk about ego inflation. There's always going to be inflation. That's the point. Your sense of self is going to expand. My I-ness, the only difference between my I-ness in terms of ego and I-ness in terms of awakening is the direction it goes in. That I maker is the energy in what we call descent, identifying. Kundalini or awakening is the same thing, but on the ascent, on the expansion. It's the same thing. You can't get rid of it. You only change your perspective on it. So when we see strong personalities, that's acceptable, as long as what's behind it is productive, valuable, and able to work with people. I don't consider myself a strong personality, but I know a lot of people do, and I probably am. That said, what keeps me from going too far is a willingness to work with people and just let them have their space. Okay, let's try that. You want to try that? Let's try that. Because at least in the experience, there could be some warning, unless of course there's going to be blowback on me or, waste of my time and resources. People are always free to do what they want to do. I always leave an open door. I've never said to anyone, well, if you leave with no, okay, look, you want to go do your thing, that's fine. we've had a great relationship up until now. I hope we still do. And if you ever want to return, you know how to get a hold of me. The door is here. And I think that's an important part, is you have to learn how to have part on good terms with people, genuinely and sincerely, because we're all going to part anyhow. This is the strong personality comes in when people over identify with their role as secret chief. I'm the mediator between the visible and the invisible. I've got these contacts and I'm going to share them with you. You know what? You may or you may not. I don't know about that. But if that's what your life is now focusing around, again, celebrity, the notion of celebrity occultist, you're in trouble and your students are in trouble. Because even if we're to help people learn how to understand themselves first and foremost, and then from that understanding, develop a healthy relationships with others and freedom. And that's where we see in occultism, I know it's been going on for a while, but there's too much of a chaining to that pillar of severity, to the sphere of hood. You have to have the social context. And that's where you've seen me write a lot about that notion of the social aspect of Venus, and that compassion and genuine joy and love and for people and experiences has to be brought out to some increased degree to bring some harmony to it. But of course, above that is Tifereth, and that means each person has to be a strong person in that as well. But then they have still other forces or other people or beings higher on the food chain to answer to as well. I hope that answers it or helps.
Wow. Well, thank you for that, Mark. That is so much to ponder there. Very pleased that you made a note reference to Venus. Venus has been one of the archetypes in astrology that for most of my life I've strongly identified with, sometimes to my own detriment. When you think of the three big zodiac signs in astrology that Venus relates to, and you ponder the roles and functions that astrological Venus contributes to the whole of humanity, psychologically, behaviorally, you figure with Libra, we have the refinement of the arts, a sense of fairness, justice, diplomacy, very important cohesive glue to keep society functioning well. When we think of Taurus, fixed earth, there is that motherly preservative quality. As a father, a single father, mind you, that is something that I have been thankful to try to incorporate. That nurturing, empathetic, preservative nature, guiding, coaching, adding particular detail to home and hearth and things like that. Venus is exalted in Pisces. Pisces is, in my assessment, one of the most psychic naturally of the signs. The sign of Pisces seems to, whether it wants to or not, have these constantly functioning feeler tendrils that's kind of scoping out all of society and picking up all the baggage of humanity, whether it wants to or not, and it's always swimming around in it. And what you mentioned there early on about sometimes the unforeseen effects of magical workings and the importance of knowing that there will be disturbances, for lack of a better word. It reminds me of when I entered on the occult path. It was, 8 years ago, I suppose. It was right after a rather devastating divorce. And, I had also had a home fire within 2 months of that divorce. So I lost everything I owned, lost my marriage, for a time, lost my sanity. And hey, what better time to completely reinvent yourself, right? So I said, okay, Eric, you're going to pour yourself into learning magic. Well, one of my good mentors early on, he was a Renaissance astrology talisman caster. This fellow was extremely eccentric. He was a mad scientist with this stuff. And he made a lucrative business with it. For some time, he provided all of Christopher Warnock with the talismans that he would sell on renaissanceastrology.com. He followed all the mandates of the Picatrix and Cornelius Agrippa, etc. And some of these would go for $3,000, $4,000 a pop, solid gold ones. But he knew what he was doing. And one of his lessons to me as a newly entered aspirant on Western esotericism was that regarding all of the Kabbalistic stuff, he said, Eric, he said, I know you don't know any Kabbalah yet, but you're going to learn it. You're going to learn a lot of it. And you're going to learn a certain style of that. Be aware of that. There's many different schools. This is not traditional Hebrew Kabbalah. It's a particular style of Western Hermetic Kabbalah. I said, okay. He said, I'm just going to tell you this, and I want you to always remember it. And I didn't understand what he was talking about until years later. But before he did any magical working at all, anything, he would always do what he called shake the tree. He said, always shake the tree. And what he was referring to is, let's say you're doing a Kabbalistic working that might have a specific operation within a certain path on the tree, or a specific Sephiroth, let's say Netzach, Venus, or whatever, right? He said, okay. He said, do not jump right into that. He said, always beforehand, invoke the divine names of every single Sephiroth. Let all of the intelligence on the whole thing know your intentions, ask for their guidance, protection, blah, blah, blah. Because if anything you do happens to be successful, it's going to create ripples. It's going to create effects. It is going to affect everything else in ways you can't predict. So he would always advise me to shake the tree, because things will be shuffled around a bit.
Well, that's pretty much it. I mean, the aspects of the tree that exist within us on a psychological level, the aspects which exist within us on a physical level, on some kind of as yet uncertain, maybe unfully formed notion within our psyche as a archetypal level, there's an impact. And within that framework of impact, we have to look at how do we approach them. Now, Jean Dubuis, who is the founder of the Philosophers of Nature, and his approach, and others that I've met, but he articulated quite well, was that you always invoke certain energies of the highest. So for us, that would look at Keter, because that's our notion of the highest. Because you can do that without destabilizing the tree. When you look at the other spheres, you always run that risk of course, because it's dynamic. The tree is very rigid and people approach it very rigid, but of course those forces are dynamic and in motion, And that when you look at these actions and that you take and the reactions, you are making impressions, on your psychic nature, on those energies that exist within you physiologically, those energies which exist within you as ideas. You are making an imprint on your psychic anatomy. You're affecting your psychic anatomy in some way. And you have to make sure that you're comfortable with that. And if you're not certain, one of the safety mechanisms is to always hand everything over to your inner self. Because the inner self, of course, is in contact with all these spheres and will maintain equilibrium. What happens is many people don't want to hand it over to their inner self. They want to hurry up and have, knowledge and conversation with their holy guardian angel so they can tell their holy guardian angel what they want from it for Christmas, rather than how to listen to it.
I've never heard anyone say it like that, but that's basically it.
That's pretty much it. You have to learn to listen to it. And that goes back to the mental training that they don't get. They don't get a good foundation, a good mental training and philosophy in the beginning that allows them to be focused, relaxed, receptive, and a little humble. And instead, they want to be supermen. They want to be super magical, tantric, whatever, supermen that are going to, shake the cosmic universe. Well, the universe has a plan of its own. In fact, there's probably quite a few plans out there, depending on which intelligences you're talking to or having a relationship with. And, your plan may not be the same as their plan. And I think, it's kind of like the Volkswagen versus the truck. The truck wins. So we have to look at our practices and ask ourselves a very simple question. How will this practice benefit me while I'm alive? What will this do for me in this life? How will this help make this life a little easier? Because we don't always want it to be in turmoil. We want some ease. And what will it do for me when I'm dead? And it's amazing how, for all the talk of astral projection and, flying on the wings of spirit and rising on the planes, most of these groups, and Golden Dawn style groups in particular, pay almost no attention to that notion of either preparing for death or the esoteric practices that are designed to allow your consciousness to survive in some degree of intact after death. And that's why we wrote Between the Gates, to provide that information. I was always surprised at that. And then I realized how few people actually had access to it. I was surprised. Same with the process between meditation, dreaming, lucid dreaming, out of body experiences, astral projection, body of light. I mean, there's a continuum of teaching here, a continuum of mental and psychic, and with that shaping of actual tangible energies, of which ritual work is only going to be a part. Ritual work is not going to substitute for an inner capacity. Ritual can augment the existing capacity, but it then has to feed back into you so that you can exist without the ritual. Because at some point you will. At some point you're going to exist without a body. How will you have a focal point? As we would say, you have to have a focal point of consciousness that can survive the immense pressures of the naught, of the nothingness, which means all of your identification is internal. Because right now, a vast amount of our identification is external. Our consciousness exists because of the stimulation we receive neurologically. So how can you maintain consciousness without stimulation? That is external stimulation. Ritual is not going to help you there. But it can't help you get to the point where you can. It can help you as long as you understand the feedback loop. So I think that ritual is an extremely important thing. However, we have to be very careful that we don't overemphasize it at the expense of inner work. And I mean truly interior, mind only, working within the energies of the mind and body only work. Now, Regardi did a pretty decent job on helping us with that with the middle pillar. However, I'm tremendously biased towards his earliest version, which is elemental. I think that is the one that you should be doing, because the other versions, there's too much going on there. It's the same thing when people do ritual work and they want to layer. And this is, again, we're referring to the Golden Dawn style. We're referring to its variations for the listeners because that is the most common. Not to turn it into a whipping post, but only because this is what you're most likely familiar with. So I want you to understand the strengths and weaknesses of this particular approach. If you want to bring up another approach, we can discuss that. Is that the notion of layering? If I add more on, so you see, we're going to add on more pantheons. We're going to add on a Enochian. We're going to create these big ritual structures that exhaust us, and then we think in that exhausted state somehow we've achieved something meaningful. Well, you may have an insight because you're so mentally exhausted, you're able to get out of your own way, and an awareness takes place. But layering on and creating massive rituals then becomes an end in and of itself. And that's where you see these things begin to break down. Because if the rituals are too complicated, particularly the initiation rituals, then the officers are not able to either understand what they're doing or can't dedicate themselves enough to the God forms required or the elemental energies required. And the ritual can still be very good, but it's not going to have the impact maybe it's intended. So I think it's better to have simple rituals that are clear, precise, and directed rather than looking for very large things. Because what if you don't have the resources to maintain that lodge or that temple structure? How are you
Especially
going?
nowadays with post COVID after 2020, brick and mortar institutions of all kinds took a major hit. And when it comes to institutions and organizations, you got to wonder the practicality behind all those investments for brick and mortar institutions going forward, now that we're all on Zoom and whatnot, really gets one wondering about the future of esotericism.
Well, and esotericism, there's Zoom is not an excuse for in-person learning. Let me make this very clear. Books are not a substitute for good instruction with a group or people or a person, a teacher. They're not, because you need a feedback loop. Okay. Our courses on Teachable are very good. They're not like what most people are going to have come across. And they are a passable substitute for being there when they were done live. But it's not going to do the work for you. Our courses are like a college course. You have to put time into it. You have to put effort into it. It's not spoon-fed to you. And that's what you see in some of these groups where don't have a connection. They would look at the Golden Dawn knowledge lectures and think that's all there was. Other lodges had other substitute lectures, other things that they would put in there. And those, like the flying rolls, evolved over time. And even the flying rolls were mostly for Adeptus Minor and above. So what about all this other stuff? There's things that have to be put in there. But even there, our courses are very good. Yet they're not a substitute for our question and answer session, where you're able to talk to me and talk to other students. And when we bring other instructors in, talk to those instructors. And that in and of itself is still no substitute for being in person. Because the quality of the psychic environment of in person is more vital. Now, again, we do the best we can with what we've got. But that goes back to the future. If the future isn't, there has to be bricks and mortar. There have to be local groups. Occultism is like politics. It's all local. If you need to, we have always encouraged the formation of local groups, because that's the only way you're going to learn to overcome your differences, learn to work with other people and make progress. Because here, if you can't, if your esoteric group or your occult lodge can't sustain itself, how can it expect, or any of its members expect, to be successful or operative in the world? There may be exceptions among the group, but the group as a whole, what kind of example are you setting? You see, that's where the group becomes a real mirror of your inner progress. It becomes a real example of what's going on, and your judgment. One of the problems we have with groups is, Masonry, say, guard you well the Western Gate, and you know what it's like in a Masonic lodge. I mean, so you let in the wrong guy, and it's like forever, because you can't really get rid of them unless they do a Masonic crime, and then you need a Masonic trial. But
Let's keep those stories
just,
to ourselves.
I know. Hopefully, they're not often, but when they are, you remember them, because it's like that bad girlfriend. I mean, it's just terrible. And what it does is it becomes a year or two or three of just, who signed this petition? Who was the investigating committee on this? And esoteric lodges are so desperate for warm bodies that they don't really guard well the Western Gate. And I was to give you an example, I was recently asked by two fine young men, brothers too, about an esoteric lodge. And I said, sure, I'll gladly run one for you. Here's what I need from you to make that happen. And there was kind of a look of shock on their faces. And I said, well, clearly you've never run anything before. So you need some experience running an organization. How about this? Go spend the next 2 years in a Masonic body that you're already a member of, in an elected position, having to deal with all those responsibilities. And, then we'll talk about an esoteric lodge. Well, why? Because you know what I'm talking about. In that format, you have to learn how to be a leader and also learning how to listen. And this goes back to, what are we producing with our esoteric groups? What's their purpose? If the purpose is just to teach ritual magic, you don't need that. That's what books and Zoom are for. If it's to create better people and have them have better examples, that's another story. I always say, and this is a hard one, I said, do you trust me? What do you mean? Well, do you trust me? Because if you don't trust me, you shouldn't be reading anything I write unless you just want to have some amusement. But when we go to a spiritual teacher, we're sitting back and we're watching them to see, how are things going more or less? Would we trust them with our house plants and our girlfriend or, keys to our car? Would we trust them? Because we're ultimately going to be trusting them with our mind or our soul, depending on how you want to phrase it. Now, that's what you're doing when you do this. You're trusting this person with your very consciousness. We need to start framing these things the way they are. And what that means is by what is the result? What is the either intended or unintended consequences?
Much of what you're speaking to seems to all around it within it be addressing the issue of maturity. And one thing I learned right off the bat in Freemasonry that I did not expect to learn, and this was particularly from some of the old timers, people may be coming for certain reasons, as you mentioned, why are you here? Why did you come? I was honest and upfront during my interview and investigation and all that. When that question was posed, I literally bursted out laughing, which is typical of me. I do that. And I said, I just came for the esoteric secrets. And then they all laughed, of course, too. But that was the truth. Now, what I found, which has been my experience with a lot of different groups, this tends to be a theme I'm noticing, and I'm listening to it and I'm watching it. The reasons I come aren't always the reasons I come, because chances are there will be something I thought I had no interest in that ends up benefiting me. With occultism, it was astrology. See, I came in with an interest in tarot, development of psychic abilities, and a fascination with symbolism, particularly the work of the Renaissance alchemists. I just love that stuff. Now, with Masonry, sure enough, I'm like, I came for the esoteric secrets. Let's all have a chuckle. And what I very early on began to learn and value and appreciate was that within that institution, if it's properly maintained, good people doing good work, you will get exposure to lessons in public speaking. As you mentioned, management skills. I would probably make a very poor accountant. Numbers have never been my gift, but God forbid I ever work my way up to a secretarial role. Whew, I'm going to have to learn the role, right? And again, like you're saying, these are life skills, life skills. So yeah, much of what you're speaking to really feels like a maturity issue. And being a fellow in my mid 30s, I find that particular issue of, okay, Eric, time to grow up. Get out of fantasy land, start putting stuff into practice, make whatever you have that's theory, practical, usable. And it's a refreshing message. I think a lot more people need to hear that in the occult community.
Well, I think we're reaching a point, with I jokingly would say to people, and quite seriously, with 2020, we were mugged by Saturn. And, that's a good thing because it forces you to recognize what is important, what is useful, and to make decisions about that. And at some point, in the effort to be open door policies in many of these organizations, there was a failure to discriminate, a failure to use good judgment. Now, many organizations that have an open door policy, eventually people kind of weed themselves out. Not always. You always get a few that manage to hang on for different reasons or make their way through. I can think of one wonderful lodge in particular. It was just so wonderful. And there's just that one fellow who, his whole identity was wrapped up in his membership. So that he became the super guardian of the doctrine. And the problem was, things worked well until he wasn't on his medication anymore. So we say, is this really the best place for him? Was this the best thing for us? Because now you have to manage him. Maybe really the best thing would have to, point him down the road to some other group. And that's the reality, because this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with powerful forces here. And, as I said, the Golden Dawn is not a reform school. And I say this is not a dating service. Okay. That was one of the biggest things I would see would cause trouble. This is not a dating service. You don't bring in your personal problems here. If you want to talk about them, we can talk about them. If you want to help them, we can help you with them. But trust me, you start that stuff here with each other, and I will shut this down without in a heartbeat, because it's not worth the trouble. Because a lot of people didn't understand how those personal things are brought to the surface very quickly and very big. So you need to be able to manage them. You have to be prepared for them, because remember, magic is inherently destabilizing. Repeat that over and over and over again. That's why you need to be patient with yourself and others. Write that down again. Patience over and over and over again. So when we look at this and this maturity issue, we can only really truly mature when we ask ourselves, what will this do for me when I'm dead? Otherwise, we just see more denial of reality, more concern with ephemeral things, even if they're very wonderful things, but it's still a strange form of dualism. It's a more enticing form of dualism, but it's still dualism, it's still duality. So we ask that question over and over again, and that's what keeps us grounded in reality. And you develop skills in groups. Those too many people want to come at esotericism to fulfill the void in their life, and then they want to be a leader to fill that sense of lack of accomplishment. I've seen it. We've all seen it. Let's not pretend otherwise. But it can still be managed if the person learns how to serve. And service means, cleaning the floor, doing what you're told, following the rules, and then taking on responsibility, because you lead by example. You lead by example. So what is the example you're setting as a leader? What is the example you're setting as a group or an organization? What is the example you're setting then out in the rest of the community? Are you a benefit to this organization or group, or are you an embarrassment to it? Guard ye well the Western Gate. Because while we're teaching people to how to be all things to all people, we can't teach all people. That's why there's so many different paths and methods. And that's hard for many people to understand, who have a very idealistic view of humanity and a very idealistic view of human potential. Just because you want to do it doesn't mean others want to. Just because they may be capable doesn't mean they want to or will. So that's where we get into these false notions of utopian ideals and how we're just going to have this sudden great awakening and this sudden enlightenment. Well, look at how you guys interact in the lodge when ritual stuff happens. What do you think is going to happen to the part of the community or society or the world? It's a denial of reality, and esotericism will constantly, in Saturn, will constantly bring us back to that reality. And that's why we move in, and I think we're moving into the phase which you see exemplified in the book of Revelations, where we see, Jesus saying, I wish thee were hot or cold, but you are lukewarm, for I spit thee out. I'd rather you are hot or cold, in or out. I don't care if you're out, that's fine. But make a commitment. And that's part of the maturation process. Is too many students don't want to make a commitment. I understand not jumping into relationships. I tell people to take their time. Do not jump in. I've told many people to go away and don't call me for a year for that very reason. Here, try this and then contact us in a year when you're done. Slow, 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 because I don't want you out. I want you in. And if you can't get in all the way, that's fine too. But I want us to both know what the boundaries of the relationship are. There has to be clarity. And, groups that have a high demand, that are very demanding of their students, such as we see in traditional observance Freemasonry, they're off the charts. People are banging on the door to get in those because more is required of them. They get more, but more is required. So we have to require more of our students. We have to, and this is all there is to it. This is the requirements, and you have to meet it if you want to move on, rather than playing the games we do. And the early Golden Dawn did that. The early Golden Dawn had set standards, and then there was complaints early on how they were reducing the requirements for each grade. Now, whether you agree with that or not is not a story, but because they're trying to keep the doors open. So part of the requirements that students are going to have to do is there's going to be definite demands on their time. The Holy Trinity is thought, word, and deed, body, speech, and mind. Or as they say, body, a mantra, energy, and mind. Okay, but it's also, that translates into thought, word, and deed. So there's going to be more demands on your time, your talent, and your treasure. How much time do you put in? How much talent do you bring? What skills do you bring? And money. Because these groups don't run on air. They're not breatharians. I mean, this, and that's the other part. That failure to commit makes many of these organizations, quasi-parasitical, because the people in them are parasitical. They don't want to commit. They want someone else to pay their bills for them. They're always hoping they can, get a room in the local Masonic lodge or something like that. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it does, but not often. So my thing is, and advice is that, yes, there's going to be constriction and contraction, but that means you have to contract and get harder, not disintegrate under that pressure. Local groups have to grow stronger, not just throw up their hands. Because if we're not problem solvers, what good are we? I mean, if we can't solve these simple problems, we're in the wrong field. We're in the wrong philosophy, and we should just admit that we are useless to ourselves and the world. And as harsh as that sounds, that's the reality, because people want to know on a practical level, what will this do for me in my life while I'm alive? And I'm asking you to answer that question along with, what will this do for you, not only while you're alive, but also when you're dead?
It certainly does seem that a lot of traditions might appear to be buckling, perhaps, in the wake of postmodernism. And golly, what are we now? About almost 50 years past the invention of chaos magic. When it comes to various esoteric traditions, institutions, everything that you've been talking about brings to mind that all of this getting mugged by Saturn business might be in our best interest for all of us, because it's forcing us to ask the important questions. It's forcing us to address the real issues. And going forward into the 21st century, I would truly love to see more of an emergence of a normalization of Western esotericism. But as you mentioned, along with that desire, I know full well that diluting it into too much of a public sphere can be detrimental. If you could toss out one simplified piece of advice, distill it to all of the occult traditions out there, what would something like that look like?
Well, you have to ask yourself, what is your vision of the future? I mean, too many occultists now are obsessed with their own version of apocalypticism. Environmental collapse, economic collapse. I've been hearing these for 50 years. I'm still here. Stock market's still here. Everything's still here. Doesn't mean there won't be problems. But why are you spending so much time and energy banking on the total collapse and failure and death and devastation of civilization? That's pathology. That's sickness. Because you are a thought creating machine all the time. The purpose of occultism is to learn to discipline that thought and direct it into desired channels. So if you're just letting it ramble off on these obsessions and these emotional, and yes, many of these complaints are true and they're legitimate and they're honest. However, what are you doing about it? What are you doing for the future? You're planning for a future that's hell on earth, which means that's basically what you want. You want your failures and lack of success and disappointments to be everyone else's failures and disappointments. So really, what do you want for the future? What do you see your organization being like 20 years from now, 40 years from now? How are you going to survive another Saturn return? And then with that, how is it going to happen? How are you going to achieve that? Because if you believe in reincarnation, you've got to ask yourself, what am I just going to leave this up in the air? Well, of course they are, because many of these people never planned for anything. Let's be honest. How many people do we know who never planned? And here's the harsh part. They come to me, they have spent money on cigars and cigarettes and booze and tattoos and streaming services and new game consoles, but they want their teachings for free. Well, a lazy man is not useful to either God or the devil. And if you have put all your time and energy and resources into this, then you're treating this as though it's an entertainment budget. And you haven't line itemed for your entertainment budget, just like you haven't line itemed for your retirement or anything else that matters. And yes, life is hard and it's difficult. And there's a lot of things that appear to be unfair and probably are unfair. So we can line them up and list them and complain all day on social media about them. But at the end of the day, you still have to deal with it. So either you can solve problems or you can't. And if you can't solve problems, occultism is only going to make them worse. And if you are only willing to complain about it and want the future to be this horrible thing, occultism is only going to make your life terrible. So unless you can be willing to sacrifice all your beloved notions and addictions and fantasies and let them go and truly sacrifice everything and dedicate yourself to becoming the best person you can be and allowing that to unfold. And that means positive. Positive means not Pollyanna, but it means a problem solver, self-confident. I mean, I see people complaining every day, and I think of the first guy I worked with. I mean, he got drafted in 1935, which meant he spent 3 years in the Czech army. And since most of your listeners don't know history, that meant 1938 rolled around, which is when the Germans invaded Bohemia and Moravia, which is Czechoslovakia. Well, he happened to be from Slovakia and was Hungarian. He ends up getting his leg broken, taken prisoner. Now he's in the Hungarian army for 3 years. Now let's do the math on that. That's 1941. Where's the Hungarian army? That's in southern Russia, north of Stalingrad. So he spent 1938 well, 1935 to 1945, in hard labor, German prison camps, hard labor camps, and 3 armies. He ended the war in the Russian army. The hand of God was over him that he survived, because 94% of the German casualties are in the Eastern Front. It was just a meat grinder of life. Now, this guy never complained about anything. And in fact, probably the most humorous moments is when he got my brother and I drunk one New Year's Eve. But the point is, these are the kind of people I grew up around and went to lodges with, occult lodges with, esoteric lodges. So they were about, life. Well, we want to talk about life not being fair. His family was murdered. So I think we really need to shake the tree here when we talk about the type of students we have and what is to be expected of them. There needs to be some serious maturity and reframing of reality, instead of the passing ephemeral obsessions that are passing for problems. Because that's the only way you're going to solve it, by really, understanding this is what the real problem is. These are the possible solutions, or maybe the only solution. And this is what I need to do to make that happen. Now you're an occultist, with or without robes. Now you're an initiate, with or without paper certificates or ritual initiations. Now you are an adept. An adept means be the one who can solve problems, one who has mastery. That mastery is ultimately over ourself, over our own lives. And that needs to be focused on. That needs to be directed. So what that means is lodges may get smaller, but they're also going to get more expensive and more demanding. And the people in them are going to be more capable, generally speaking. And I think you will have, again, some degree of occulture, but that's going to be so ephemeral. That's going to come and go. That's going to be, because it can't be any other way. It's seasonal. But you have to look for the things which are perennial, which are eternal to some degree.
Well, Mark, you've given us so much to consider today. I really do appreciate it. It's been a pleasure having you. And before we go, where can people find you on the internet and connect with the Institute of Hermetic Studies?
Well, the Institute for Hermetic Studies does have a website, and it is that. It's just Google us, you'll see it. And we do have programs at Teachable, and those programs are, as I said, they're really not like much of what you may have seen elsewhere. It is not a regurgitation of, the same lessons from one group or another. And this is really an in-depth analysis of some very obscure aspects of practice as well. So you can find those on Teachable, and you can take them a la carte. That is as you wish, or you can sign up for a program, an organized program of study. It's really up to you. And we do have, of course, question and answer and support sessions. And generally, we have Vox Hermes too, which is at WordPress. So you can find our blog there. And we do have a Patreon account for those who would like to get a little something extra. And anyone can email me at info@hermeticinstitute.org, and we'll send them whatever links or information they're after. And just appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think this is really important stuff and material that we discussed, because it's for all of us. It will improve the quality of all of our spiritual direction and experience as more people take this to heart and openly discuss it with one another, and really bring these questions to the forefront. Where are we going here? Where is this lodge going to be in 20 years? What is the purpose of this teaching? How does this serve me while I'm alive, when I'm dead? And what is the future what future are we building for our tradition? That's all. Ask these questions and seriously discuss them. And I think you're going to find the answers are going to be very insightful.
Your message is definitely a timely one today.
Thank you.
Well, Mark, I love your work. Keep it up, and we'll be in touch in the future. Thank you.